Welcome to a special podcast edition of the Eastern Neighborhood Bulletin. On today's podcast, we're talking Belarus, the country of 9 million with Europe to the west, Ukraine to the south, and Russia to the east. I'll be speaking with Alesia Rudnik, a leading expert on Belarus and the director of the Center for New Ideas, a Warsaw-based research center which works with civic and political actors to build a democratic and resilient future Belarus. Listeners are likely familiar to some extent with Belarus and its politics. Alexander Lukashenko, who was once commonly referred to as Europe's last dictator, has ruled the country with a consolidated authoritarian regime since the mid-1990s, and has spent recent years further aligning his country with Russia, allowing Russians to use Belarus as a base of operation for its 2022 invasion of Ukraine, and integrating the economic, informational, and political spheres of the two countries. But what many consider to be the biggest turning point in Belarus in recent years came in 2020, not 2022, when Lukashenko's regime faked the results of national elections, which in turn triggered mass protests in response. After the demonstrations and ensuing repressions, hundreds of thousands of Belarusians, including much of its political opposition, fled Belarus to neighboring countries. I wanted to not only further understand Belarus's politics and its future, but specifically learn more about this exile community and the political institutions they have built in places like Poland and Lithuania. Luckily enough, Alesia Rudnik, who herself leads one such exile institution, agreed to speak with me. With Trump now eager to force some kind of settlement in the Russo-Ukrainian war, and the political ripple effects felt across Eastern Europe, we had a lot to talk about. So, without further introduction, I take you now to my interview with Alesia Rudnik. Welcome to this special edition of the Eastern Neighborhood Bulletin in a podcast format. I'm speaking now with Alesia Rudnik, who is the director for the Center of New Ideas, a think tank based in Warsaw, Poland, that works on issues relating to Belarus and democratic futures for that country. Alesia is also a PhD candidate in political science at Karlstad University, located in Karlstad, Sweden, and she's speaking to me today from Stockholm. Alesia Rudnik, welcome, and thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Nick. Hi.
I'd like to start off with a general issue that I've at least have been interested in for a long time, and that's the Belarusian exile movement. So can you sort of describe this group? I understand that your organization is basically made up of Belarusian exiles. How large is it? How did it leave Belarus? And how is it organized abroad?
Well, if you mentioned already the organization, I might also illustrate the process of Belarusian exiling from the country based on political grounds. On example of our organization, I think it would make a clear-cut and relevant illustration as well. So most of my team has resided in Belarus before 2020 and slightly after 2020 as well. And most of the people had additional jobs or were totally full-time working with us. I was the only one then residing abroad. It was actually quite a big issue, right? That I was not always present in the country. And I also considered moving back to Belarus after finalizing my master's program then. And the situation that happened with Belarusian people in 2020 has pushed a lot of people in exile due to the political repression, due to political pressure on those who have not maybe been prosecuted directly, but saw an immediate threat upcoming. And we saw how it was realized on the example of the independent media in the second half of 2021. But our team has relocated quite early. The reason for that was that one of my colleagues has actually started to campaign together with one of the oppositional candidates, Viktor Babarika, in the beginning of the electoral campaign, and that was seen as an immediate threat for the whole organization, but because he was actually driven by the security forces to the border with Ukraine, and together with his colleague, he had to leave the country, basically pushed out from the country. And this was one of the first examples of people being forcefully taken to the border with either the European Union, then the borders were open, and to Ukraine, as in this case. So this is just a small illustration, and then the whole team has also left. And this happened to many, many organizations. Those who thought that there was no immediate threat to them has later experienced, for example, the NGO crackdowns when the authorities at the same day came to the offices of the NGOs And civil society organizations then decided to just, arrest whomever they could, to initiate the searches, the house searches, the office searches, and confiscate all the equipment that organizations had. And in a similar manner, there was also a crackdown on the largest independent media outlet, then called Tudbay. Now it's called Zerkalo, or Mirror in English. And this was a big sign of authorities showing that they will not tolerate independent media reporting. And after that, many of the independent media as well exiled. And since then, the repression wave has basically escalated to the level when the authorities decided they will prosecute anyone they can reach, basically. And these were people either expressing their political opinions directly, working with target groups, such as helping the various groups, such as people with disabilities, elderly people, and everything you can imagine. So all types of support that civil society organizations do was basically...
So even apolitical organizations as well, then?
Exactly. And it has developed to the degree when we saw the shutdowns and recognition as extremists of such organizations as, for example, bird watchers, who have not actually represented any kind of threat directly to the regime. But the logic of the regime, as many experts believe, and I share this opinion, is the fact that the regime has been trying to crack down on anyone who has the mobilization potential. So if people can mobilize based on any kind of non-governmental initiative or non-governmental activities, such as, organized by the government, festivals and meetings and support demonstrations for the authorities, everything else was seen as a threat. So basically it has led to many people either migrating and leaving the country after the crackdowns of various types on civil society or independent media, or actually upon the persecution of one of their members. But also, I must say that many people who have not discussed yet is the regular Belarusians who have been observing the situation in the country. And even though they may have not been directly involved with some of the organizations and have not been a core of political resistance, they've decided to leave the country because it no longer provides kind of security guarantees, safety guarantees, because that the repressions can expand at any moment, and it is unpredictable. The regime did not really follow any laws, any regulations, so it was pretty much a lottery for people to know whether they will be arrested or not, and thus many people have left for security reasons. Others have left for economic reasons as well, because the businesses and IT sector have been really, really struggling after the protest of 2020 with securing their normal lives, because everything they did was censored, was checked by the various institutions and bodies that have not been doing such interrogations and checks on the businesses before. So thus, a lot of people also left to just live a calmer life and earn their money without any risks of prosecution. It has escalated to the degree that young people were trying to leave the country as soon as they finished the school, and the regime saw this trend growing, and thus they have introduced a lot of restrictions for the students, for example, that you cannot directly receive your diploma. They were delaying these processes, and without a diploma, you cannot start your studies abroad, etc. So there were many, many measures taken by the regime that have led people voluntarily or forcefully leave the country, because otherwise they will end up in prison. And the exile community of Belarusians also looks quite diverse if we think not geographically wise, because everyone is basically surrounded or located in Poland or Lithuania. But if we think about the demographics, right, and profiles of people who live abroad, I would very generally divide this exile community into two groups, maybe, or maybe three groups. One would be the political active and civil society activists, those who had something to do with the democratic resistance in Belarus in 2020. The second part, or the second group, would be the businessmen and IT sector people who left for better economic conditions and also for the safety of their businesses and for better future generally. And the third group would be then Belarusians, individuals who maybe took part in protests and do not engage politically nowadays, but have been joining maybe the protests or in some way expressing their political opinions in 2020. But now they're quite depoliticized outside of the country. And if we very briefly try to structure how this active part of Belarusians from the first group looks like, there would be primarily the structures of the political opposition. So those people who have been either organizing the electoral campaign in 2020 or those who have joined the political institutions after that. That would also include the newly established structures of the Belarusian opposition, such as the Coordination Council and the National United Cabinet. The cabinet of the opposition of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and then a couple of other structures that have been established. Some of them were already closed, some of them still exist. And basically, this could also include the civil society organizations, such as those who have been closed by the Belarusian authorities, or those who have been establishing their activities or rebranding their organizations in exile. And mostly they then would reside in Poland or Lithuania.
It's a very similar situation, it seems, to the sort of Russians who have left since 2022, even in the sense that you can sort of break them up into more politically motivated migrants versus people who left because they were concerned about mobilization or the economic future of the country. You mentioned that this group is largely centered in Poland and Lithuania. What kind of relationship is there between the Belarusian diaspora and these governments? Are they supportive? I know that there sometimes are conflicts between the Lithuanian government and some Belarusian groups on issues related to historical memory and things like that. So what has the relationship been like for Belarusians in exile with those two governments?
That's correct. And there have been some conflicts. Some of them are considered, or the expert community at least believes that this is pretty much artificial conflicts that were related to the national historical heritage, etc. But some of them have gone pretty far in the public agenda. And this is the one that you mentioned, that there have been parliamentary hearings in Lithuania. There have been different initiatives related to using the code of arms that is very similar to Lithuania. And this is a historical code of arms for Belarusians, and also support to the Belarusian businesses and activists and political activists who have been using these symbols that for some Lithuanians seem to be belonging to the historical heritage of Lithuania because of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, right? That is very much debated topic between the Belarusian and Lithuanian historians.
A lot of inside baseball for people who study Eastern Europe, I should say.
Right, exactly.
Cut. Yeah,
exactly. It's a very complicated topic, and for many Belarusians, it was also a surprise because they grew up with a certain picture of history, and then arriving to Lithuania and facing the contradicting image of history was also quite surprising. And in that manner, I would say that this is the probably biggest conflict that we saw so far. But of course, there are other types of conflicts, and they are much more serious because they actually represent a threat for Belarusians who left the country on political grounds. And here I will just take upon the case of Sweden, which has not been very accommodating for Belarusians because, first of all, of course, Belarusians don't come here very often, but also because of the number or percentage of rejections for the asylum applications. And numerous Belarusians have been rejected their asylum in Sweden, but even though some of these cases are under the Dublin Agreement, and that they were not supposed to arrive to Sweden, but to the country that issued their visa initially. But some of them are actually very much peculiar, and there have been cases of deportation. And one of the recent cases of deportation has also included transportation of the activists from Sweden to the border of Lithuania and Belarus, and then the person was detained in Belarus. This is just one of the examples, and it is not so clear what exactly happened, but the clear evidence is that as long as the person gets deportation decision by the Swedish authorities, it probably will lead to the persecution or detention of the person on the Belarusian border. And this is what happened here. And a couple of other cases were also honestly ridiculous, when people got their rejection and were sent to Russia, for example, because that might not represent such a big threat for them compared to the to entering Belarus. So, and a couple of these cases also exist in Georgia, when people have received some kind of right to live there. Well, Belarusians actually don't need any visa or anything to reside in Georgia, but most of the asylum applications have been rejected, and people were also banned from entering Georgia. Even though they have a right on paper, but they were banned from entering Georgia after visiting the European Union. But this is also can be explained by the situation that we observe in Georgia currently. And a couple of such cases also happened across Europe. But in Poland, for example, Poland, in terms of legal support, has been very much very supportive to Belarusians who have been applying to asylum, who have been receiving protection from the Polish authorities, and Polish politicians have been also expressing their support not only to Belarusians but also to the structures of Belarusian opposition, to politicians, to Tikhanovskaya personally. There have been multiple events, multiple grants, support, etc. So, and for the case of Lithuania, aside from this conflict, and if we look back to 2020, 2021, a lot of Belarusians entered Lithuania as their first country and received a lot of support there, especially when we think of activists, journalists. They have been treated well when it comes to the legal terms at the beginning of their relocation, and only later we saw some issues regarding the, for example, Lithuanian authorities deciding to revoke the permits because the person has served in the Belarusian army, which is also a bit strange in one way, because the Belarusians cannot avoid serving in the army if they want to remain in the country because it's mandatory. And this was seen as kind of an indication of threat, potential national threat for Lithuania, which is also triggered by the Belarus involvement into the full-scale invasion. And this was basically a couple of cases that I can remember that were conflicting or contradicting, but otherwise, I think Lithuania, Poland, and actually Czech Republic as well have been quite supportive for the Belarusian society and for the Belarusian activists.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's this conflict at the political level in Lithuania over nationalist issues. But at the same time, I believe Lithuania recognizes Tikhanovskaya as the legitimate head of state of Belarus, and it might be the only Western government to formally recognize her organization as the official legitimate government of Belarus. But I'd like
right. It's very tricky. I will just stop here for a second, because formally there have been a couple of cases when Tikhanovskaya has been addressed as the president-elect, for example, and it has been a case of the Polish politicians. Once there was also the Swedish prime minister who addressed her like that, but this was mostly in the statements and in some kind of speeches, right? So it was not a formal recognition, but indeed Lithuania has provided the legal status as well to the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and supports her but I would not say that they treat Lukashenko as illegitimate president, but Tsikhanovskaya as legitimate president. So this is the important point to mention. They still treat Lukashenko as head of Belarus.
There's a comparison that could be made. It might be a sort of a foreshadowing of what we're going to see with Georgia and Solomon Zorbachvili, who sort of claims to represent the presidency of Georgia, even though in Georgia, Georgian Dream has sort of moved her aside. But of course, there's issues there. I'd like to pivot now from the Exile community back into Belarus itself. This past January, Belarus held national elections, which were, of course, heavily controlled, and to nobody's surprise, Lukashenko emerged victorious. So my understanding of Belarusian public opinion is that there are three constituencies, basically: anti-Lukashenko, apolitical, and pro-Lukashenko. That the pro-regime position is actually in the minority within the country. At the same time, however, sort of Russia is pushing for more and more integration with Belarus. That actually there is a treaty on the books from the late 90s called the Union State Treaty that was developed that supposedly lays the legal foundation for a single political entity comprising Russia and Belarus, and that has received a great deal more political attention in Moscow in recent years. So it seems to me that the regime is facing these two sort of pressure points, one being public opinion and the other being Moscow pushing for more integration. So what do you think the future of it's a very big question, I know. Maybe it should be broken up into smaller questions, but I'm curious what you think about the future of the regime. Where's the biggest threat for the regime coming from? What do you think its future is?
Right. Indeed, big question. And I will again start with a small remark here regarding the population. I would actually say that there are four clusters, so pro-regime, pro-position, and then, as you said, depoliticized, apolitical Belarusians, but also those who are neutral. And neutrality is expressed in supporting none of the existing political forces, right? Neither Lukashenko or the opposition. But it doesn't mean that they don't have and don't express political views and are not interested in politics. And actually, the interesting thing here is if we look at the independent opinion polls that are mostly held by the Chatham House that is partnered with us with Center of New Ideas for the Project Belarus Initiative, where we publish all the polls. We saw that from 2020 to 2025, the cluster of neutral Belarusians who are not ready to express their support to either of the political camps has been actually growing. And this is also, on the one hand, a reflection of the fear factor, right? To not express the political views in the current situation where it's very dangerous to talk about these things and to take part in the opinion polls. But actually, this effect has been also measured and addressed by the sociologist, and is approximately 10%, has approximately 10% effect, right? So everything else is attributed to some other factors, which are, in the view of experts who look closely to these polls, can be connected to many things, such as, for example, again, the engagement of Belarus into Belarusian regime into the support of Kremlin in their aggression against Ukraine. This is very important because if we look at the people who actually support Russia in war, we see that the number could have been smaller, and this does not necessarily correspond to the percentage of the Belarusians who support the opposition, so it's slightly bigger. And when it comes to supporting Belarus' potential involvement directly in the conflict, here we have a consensus, the societal consensus, so that even the pro-regime elites and pro-regime respondents do not share the idea of Belarus joining aggression on Ukraine on Russia's side. They want to remain neutral and they want to keep distance. So shortly, there are more Belarusians who support the Russian military operation, how they call it, the special military operation, who support war, and less Belarusians who are ready to see Belarus directly engaging on the Ukrainian territory in this war. So in this matter, we we can also reflect about Belarusian future in terms of how it will be developing through the lens of the conflict in Ukraine, right? Because what we saw in these opinion polls is that this geopolitical context has actually divided Belarusians even more, and it has also intensified or radicalized some of the positions of those Belarusians who maybe had more neutral stances towards the internal political situation, right? So here we have more clear camps when it comes to estimating and expressing their opinions on war in Ukraine. So I think that the future of Belarus will strongly depend on how the regional situation will develop. And it's not only about how the negotiations on war will occur. Now we're talking actually about negotiations, right? Funny, because before, a couple of months before, we were talking that the war maybe not ending within the upcoming 5 years or something like that, the frozen conflict and all the other scenarios. Now we're talking about the potential negotiations, and these negotiations will in many ways predetermine the future of Belarus as the regional actor when it comes to security, when it comes to integration with Russia, because if Lukashenko is not ready to support Putin in the same way as he did in 2022, then there might be some of the ways to renegotiate the terms of the relations with the West, with the US, and specifically with the US, but also with the European Union. And it will maybe modify the situation. But if Lukashenko is not ready to actually provide Putin with his support, he will probably enjoy the situation a little bit more than the political context looks now for him. And it means that the geopolitical situation will basically determine what is happening with Belarus. And now I'm thinking that for Lukashenko, it's important to mention that for Lukashenko, this is the outcome of war will be the factor that will basically predict his actions in the future, right? How well will Belarus be integrated with Russia, or whether there will be some chances for Belarus to actually reestablish its relations with the West. But for the Belarusian civil society and for Belarusian society in general, I do not see the optimistic picture. I rather tend to be really pessimistic here. And you probably can guess why, because we saw that the support from the US is decreasing for the civil societies and USAID and a lot of other programs that have been really important for the activities of civil society, for activities of independent media are now shutting down. And this is a really, really worrying situation for the future of these initiatives, because before we were talking about survival of these initiatives in exile, and now we're talking about the potential shutdowns and basically the extinction of the democratic resistance in exile. So if these forces will not be preserved outside of the country, it will be very difficult to see how they will be able to bring their potential and their work back to Belarus when the opportunity comes. So in that way, for the Belarusian society, it will be about re-establishing the activities from zero, from the ground and from the roots again. It will be about, again, renegotiating terms with the regime. What will the Lukashenko regime allow or not allow? Will the status of extremist organizations lifted from the independent media, from civil society organizations? What will be the opportunities for these actors to actually work within the country? This will determine a lot of things, a lot of potential for democratization. But the most I would say that my pessimism comes from the scenario that will completely exclude Belarusians who have been active in 2020 from any kind of picture in the future. So in case Lukashenko is actually able to return the US embassy to Minsk, and USAID is no longer supporting those activists in exile, and Lukashenko is not permitting Belarusians to get back to the country without persecution, without threat to their security and their work, and as well their audience and their target groups, then we will basically see the sterilized society that is living again in this apolitical context where they are not allowed to talk on politics, but at the same time partially legitimized by the international actors. And this will be basically a recognition of the autocratic system in Belarus, and the authoritarian regime will be more and more consolidated through this external legitimation, but also through the fact that many Belarusians who are in exile and will realize that they will not be able to return to the country, they will basically realize that, okay, it's not possible, so probably we continue our lives abroad. And this will leave the country without many talented and politically engaged Belarusians who could have been working for the future of the country's democracy. So yeah, that would be my most realistic prediction. But again, we know that the situation is developing really rapidly, and we see that every day we have news when it comes to negotiations and various other news on support, etc. So let's see where the time takes us. But so far, I would not hope for the very bright future and possibilities of, for example, Belarusians fighting in Ukraine, getting back to the country and taking power from Lukashenko, or Belarusian democratic forces that have been really, let's be honest, losing their legitimacy during the last years. And with this recent turn in US foreign policy, we see that their opportunities for the future are also shrinking, and their role will probably also be shrinking unless Europe steps up, supports them again, and promotes their participation in negotiations or any other ideas that will be tried in the future months.
So you hit upon 2 points that I'd like to sort of pull from your comments there, that I especially like. One being the sort of ramifications for Belarus in other ways that so many people have left. That by sort of cracking down as heavily, Lukashenko has, by way of destroying the opposition, also sort of destroyed much of the country's economic and cultural future. That, this huge cohort of people who are talented in a variety of ways have just sort of voluntarily left, and that is probably a positive for the regime, because this is sort of a dangerous population to them. But it's negatively impacted the country's broader future in non-political ways, which again, I think is also the case in Russia. And then secondly, the destruction of U.S. aid and the gutting of a whole variety of international development and democracy promotion organizations does, I think, in a meaningful way, open the door to better relationships between the United States and a variety of authoritarian countries. And even in the Eastern European region, we've seen this already with both Georgian Dream and Azerbaijan, that both of those states have welcomed the news of USAID's destruction. And it's because these were seen as hostile organizations that were going to spread dangerous democratic ideas. So I think I think there is something to be said about that vis-a-vis Belarus as well. So,
totally agree. Yep.
Yeah. So you already sort of touched on this a bit, but we are sort of living through a pretty drastic turnaround in American foreign policy, and it is impacting Eastern Europe, of course. The Trump administration is pushing hard for some kind of settlement of the war in Ukraine, and sidelining Ukraine and the European Union in the process. And already we've seen the United States capitulate to several major Russian demands. How do you think these developments will impact Belarus? You've sort of already discussed this, but are they being felt, or how are they being felt in the Belarusian exile community? When you see Rubio meeting with Lavrov in Riyadh, when you hear that the Americans are pushing for a settlement, how is that news received in the Belarusian exile community, and how do you think it'll impact the future of the country?
This is a very, I would say, this is a very tricky question because recently we have seen kind of a conflicting situation within the Belarusian expert community, but also within the Belarusian political community. So those who are still hoping for Trump's administration to bring some positive results for Belarusian society as well. And despite the hit on the foreign aid and the work of the independent media and civil society organizations, so the conflict or the perception of new foreign policy of the US comes from the logic that one part of the exiled civil society, or generally society in exile, thinks that Trump's administration is destroying the democratic future of Belarus by not recognizing the agency of political actors, independent media, and cutting off financial resources by, what I said before, depriving them of the possibility to survive in exile and then bring the experience and the potential back to the country. But most importantly, also to continue being a channel for Belarusians inside the country, right? To provide them independent news, to provide hope in some cases, and to continue having some dialogue with Belarusians who are still interested in politics and interested in a better future. So this is one opinion, right? And the second opinion, which is surrounded by this idea that Trump's administration will probably foster the release of political prisoners. We have seen that a couple of American citizens have been released from the Belarusian prisons. We saw also for the first time in many months that a couple of journalists of Radio Free Europe, were also shown on the Belarusian TV, on the propaganda TV, which is basically now considered as a sign of proof of life, basically that they still live, because many of political prisoners who are well-known and famous journalists, activists, are restrained and kept under the incommunicado regime, and they have no access to their lawyers, to meetings with their families, and even to the letters to the prisons. So of course this was also perceived as a positive signal, the fact that the regime, due to the communication with the US administration, was showing the proof of life and then also releasing some of the prisoners. And this is giving hope to some of the Belarusians, because they think that it's more important to release political prisoners from the Belarusian prisons rather than trying to support those who live in exile. So this very pragmatic stance is also related to the humanitarian approach and position that some of the political actors have been expressing for a long time, that it's not time to try and win over Lukashenko and get access to power, but it's time to release the hostages, right, from the Belarusian prisons. But at the same time, I see the problem with this logic, or with this position, in the fact that something tells me that Trump's administration, or the current approach to communicating with the whole region, but with the Belarusian authorities specifically, is aimed at releasing the American citizens and releasing those who have worked for American organizations or American media, but not necessarily insisting on the release of everyone from the Belarusian prisons. So I think that in this case we may come to the situation when all the Belarusian prisoners will still remain in prison, but the US will negotiate the release of American citizens, basically. So I'm not very optimistic when it comes to these forecasts made publicly on the release of all political prisoners. But let's hope that I'm wrong, and that this will at least positively impact on the number of political prisoners in Belarusian prisons. But again, as you mentioned before, exclusion of Ukraine, exclusion of Europe from potential negotiations is also a big hit for the Belarusian political forces, because, now oppositional forces, because they have been expecting actually not necessarily their place on the table, but someone to represent their agenda, someone to represent actually the agenda of Belarusians who hold pro-democratic views and who want better changes in the country. And that could have been not directly Belarusian opposition, but European politicians who would then serve as a channel, as a voice, basically, of Belarusian democratic forces, and I guess the Russian democratic opposition as well. But now we see that this potential is also very small, and we may actually occur in the situation when, due to this process of negotiation that it has been a big hope for many democratic agents and actors outside of Belarus, but also, I guess, similar situation for Russia. It will not be any kind of possibility to articulate the needs, articulate the vision for the future of the country, and it will not only lead to the dangerous outcome for Ukraine. That I'm not here an expert on Ukraine, but again, certainly there is no need to be an expert to see that this is certainly a threat for legitimacy of Zelensky himself, but also the agency. It's a deprivation of agency of Ukrainian citizens who cannot take part in the negotiation that regard the war in their country, but does include the actor that has initiated this aggression and war. So this is very problematic, and this is a big regional problem that will also bring together, with the things that I already mentioned, they will bring together for Belarus this danger that we discussed before, the danger of legitimation of Lukashenko by this through Putin, basically legitimation of Lukashenko through Putin, because as you mentioned before, the relations of US with autocracies might actually develop in the future, and the new political language, the new political rules and the international agenda is probably to be established, and the authoritarian regimes may have place around any kind of table of not only on negotiation table, but generally when it comes to various international agreements, etc. So their generally role of autocratic regimes will be growing, and this is a danger for the whole world, basically. So the more authoritarian regime receive attention, possibilities to communicate on equal grounds with the democratic countries, the less threats they see, and the more proactive measures they might be taken in the future that actually can lead to very dangerous results. And Belarus, being inspired by recognition of Putin by the US, will also probably not consider, or Lukashenko himself will not consider, any softening of repression, because he sees that for Putin there is no actually policy of sanctioning him for repressive measures and for aggression against the other country. And Lukashenko is not involved or initiating any kind of aggression on other countries. So for him, the aftermath may be even softer. And I don't think that he will be as afraid of the worsening international image as he has been during the couple of last years.
I think also if a settlement is forced on the Ukrainians and the Kremlin comes out of the war feeling that it was worthwhile and feeling that they won, I think the other sort of expansionist projects that Moscow has, whether that's in Georgia or Belarus or Moldova as well, actually, I think they could conceivably become much more aggressive if they think that their aggression in Ukraine has basically worked out for them. Something that I follow quite closely is Abkhazia, and in the last year, there's been a huge amount of a huge push by Moscow to force greater and greater degrees of integration with that small territory, and I think something similar could play out in Belarus quite easily.
Right. Right, completely agree. And here I can mention in a recent book of Anne Applebaum, there called Autocracy Inc., there has been this central message, I say, from the book that Autocracy Incorporated is basically about the authoritarian countries building their ties, stronger ties together, and building their corporation, international corporation, to network, to exchange experience, and to strengthen each other, to build their own kind of alliances and different types of ties when it comes to economic sphere, political sphere, inspire each other, help each other, assist each other, and push the boundaries of the democratic world, of the norms, of the existing democratic values, right? And at the same time, the democratic world, as she argues in the book, does not have this kind of corporation and networking to the same degree, and does not strive to build these ties, to build a strong international community, which is being challenged strongly by the authoritarian forces, by various far-right parties and politicians. And I strongly agree with this point, because for a long time we have lived in a world where democracy was taken for granted. And now we see that it can be actually challenged quite easily through the populist rhetoric, through addressing one burning issue to the electorate and promoting yourself as a politician who will solve this issue in the future. But actually, it will result most likely in autocracies growing more and more and becoming stronger and stronger. And who knows what effects it will have for some hybrid regimes, for semi-democracies that are actually on the way, that were on the way to democracy, but are now maybe inspired to join some autocratic alliances, right? So for the whole world, this turn in the US politics, I think, is very dangerous, right? And we will probably observe some tremendous changes in the future.
Yeah. I also think you can even forget about regime type and look more at the international level. The central argument that the Russians and I think also the Chinese have been making for the last decade and a half or so is that the natural state of things is to have spheres of influence for great powers, and smaller countries are sort of absorbed into them whether they like it or not. And by stating that Ukraine will not join NATO, by not inviting the Ukrainians to the negotiating table, the United States in recent weeks has basically voiced agreement with that point and sort of welcomed a renewed era of spheres of influence where countries like Ukraine do not get to be sovereign over their own international relations.
Absolutely agree.
Alesia Rudnik of the Center for New Ideas, sobering remarks, but very valuable. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Nick.
That's all for my interview with Alesia Rudnik. If you'd like to check out more of her work, I've linked her own personal webpage as well as that of the Center for New Ideas in the show notes below. For Eastern Neighborhood Bulletin subscribers, keep your eyes peeled for Thursday's newsletter and for future podcasts, which I'm hoping to record once a month or so. Thanks for joining us, and best wishes.